Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. In this workshop, we bring in scholars from across the country to present insights from their research and experience to the NDSU community. Topics focus on innovation, opportunity, and ways to increase individual and societal flourishing. And I'm really excited that today we're joined by John Winters from Iowa State University. President Cook and Kate Cook are also from Iowa State University, or from Ames as well, so he mentioned that, so it's a great day for them as well today. So I'm really excited that John is here. We had a really great discussion yesterday. He presented his research on the fracking boom and how it's affected population growth. So John Winters is a professor of economics at Iowa State University. He earned a Ph.D. in economics from Georgia State University and a BA in economics from Mississippi State University. He's a native of Memphis, Tennessee, and he grew up in Northwest Mississippi. His research focuses mainly on regional economics and labor economics with specific topics including the migration of college students and graduates, human capital effects on regional economies, individual education outcomes, STEM labor market issues, self-employment outcomes, and the impacts of economic shocks, such as the fracking boom. His research has been published in numerous top field journals. John is a founding editor of Reaching Regions, an outreach journal for regional science. He also serves on several journal editorial boards. And today he's going to talk to us about human capital in the Heartland, looking at workforce issues, the role that higher education plays, and again, how can we attract skilled workers to this region? And this is something that's really important for North Dakota. It's very important for the Midwest. It's very important for NDSU, and I'm really excited that John is here today. So thanks. He spent a 6.5-hour drive, maybe a 7-hour drive if he took a break to come here, and he's going to head back tonight. So that's a lot of dedication to take that drive to come here. So let's all give a warm welcome to John Winters.
Thank you, John. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. If not, wave in the back and let me know. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. I appreciate it. Again, going to talk about human capital in the Heartland. And so we'll define what we mean by these things, and then, tell you a little bit about some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, some of the successes. And so starting with what is human capital. Again, this is an area that is important for me. I teach a graduate class in labor economics, and half of the course is really focused on human capital. Human capital is a lot of things, right? If I want to summarize it, it has to do with the knowledge, skills, abilities that are useful, right? Useful in life, useful in the labor market, useful, in lots of things. And so, again, a lot of students, right, are building their human capital. Why are they building their human capital? A lot of time it's to get a job, to get a better job, to get a high paying, enriching job. And it turns out, human capital is associated with higher incomes, right? And again, there's a lot of debate on how much of that's causal. We're just going to punt on that. Maybe you can take my word for it that a lot of it's causal, not all of it. There's also signaling and other things that go into it. But higher incomes are a big component of human capital. Also better health. And so there's a lot of research on this, that people get more education, more human capital, they have better health. Part of that is probably the income effect, right? Turns out having more money on average is not bad. It's probably good. Most of us want more money, and we can buy better health care, et cetera. But there's also some other things too that it can kind of change your behavior. For example, if I get educated, I learn that smoking is bad, and maybe even learn exactly how bad it is and decide, maybe I shouldn't smoke. Other things too, right? There's evidence that it is tied to relationship success. Now, again, this may be, financial resources and other stuff, or it may just be that it makes people maybe a little more thoughtful about who they partner up with and how they interact in those relationships. All sorts of other things in terms of happiness and well-being. So that's all good and well. There's also a lot of evidence that human capital has what we call spillover benefits, right? So my human capital can benefit the other people around me. Your human capital can benefit the people in your classes, the people in your community. your neighbors, your friends, your family, et cetera. And so that's good, right? One of the big factors there is innovation, right? So if people develop human capital, that helps them be creative thinkers, that helps them be problem solvers, that helps them be job creators, right? So that's a big deal. And so, we're pretty bullish on human capital, right? Again, it's not perfect, but we're optimistic. Now, again, I said human capital kind of vague. It's just knowledge, skills, and abilities. If we want to be a little more specific, I obviously hit it at education, but it's not just education, right? That's an important thing. We do get a lot of our human capital from our family, especially our parents. And so I start here, there's nature and nurture. And so, in some ways, I think Psychology 101, when I was a freshman in college, we talked about nature versus nurture. And I actually sort of like wrestled with that debate for a second. Then I think eventually, textbooks or somebody convinced me, not really by the end of that semester, but eventually that it's both, right? There's certainly kind of nature components, but also nurture, our environments matter. And for some things, they matter more than others. And so if you want to think about height, right, what is the single best predictor of a child's height going to be? It's their parents' height. Now, nutrition matters too, obviously, but beyond some point, right, it doesn't matter as much. For other things, right, the environment can matter a lot more in terms of, are there pollutants, or do we have enrichment, et cetera. But there's also maybe level effects that past some point, those don't necessarily matter at times. Certainly schools, again, that's a big factor. That's one we think about a lot. Your peers, so this is probably one of the most underrated. We know peer pressure is a thing. People, do crazy things because of their peers, but you also learn a lot from your peers. I was introduced to Monty Python by some of my friends. I was introduced to Star Wars. So my parents were not into Star Wars, never watched Star Wars, but when I was, I don't know, an early teenager, one of my friends is like, "You haven't seen Star Wars, right? You got to watch this. It'll change your life." And he was right? So you learn a lot of stuff from your peers, from your, obviously your I have siblings on here, right? I've learned both good and bad things from my siblings, your friends, your classmates, et cetera. Obviously, we learn a lot from the media. The media is very, I would say, somewhat controversial right now, so we'll just move past that one. And you learn from life, right? So again, playing with toys, touching hot stoves, et cetera, we learn by the environment around us. And again, at work, right? So when you start your first job, oh, I learned all this stuff in school, but you really don't necessarily know what the work life is like, what workplaces are like, but you get some training, you get some experiences, hopefully you get some mentors or some coworkers that kind of take you under their wing and say, hey, this is kind of how we do things. Doesn't mean you got to do it exactly like them. But you learn all along the way. And so again, the point is human capital is this broad thing, a lot of different components. And now I'm going to tell you that, like, for better or worse, it's hard to measure a lot of this. So economists, which is what I am, do focus a lot on formal education, on schooling. And the reason I did that is that's where the light is, and that means that's what's easy to measure, right? We have lots of survey data where we ask people, well, how much education do you have? And it's pretty highly correlated with the things that I talked about before. It is not a perfect or complete measure, but that's, again, what we'll kind of focus on. And again, we're an institution of higher education, so education is good, right? Now, another important point, right, this human capital for the Heartland thing is to recognize that migration and human capital are connected in a lot of ways. And so pretty well known and long established that as people get more education or as people build more human capital, it makes them more geographically mobile. They're more likely to migrate. And so there's a lot of reasons for that, right? And we'll talk more later. But of course, not everybody moves, right? And so there's this kind of tension between moving or staying. A lot of my research kind of gets at that. And so a lot of people are tied to their home areas, right? They're tied to where they were born, where they grew up, where their family lives. That's often, because of the attachment to the people, but it's also attachment to the places, right? There's things that are valuable to you, that you like living there. You like, the familiarity, the comfort. I say there's also a sense of belonging. I would say in general economics doesn't like to talk about this, but I think it's true and almost self-evident. that, you want to feel like where you're at. If you're going to live somewhere, you want to feel like you belong there. And a lot of people do feel like they belong, somewhere they've been before. They maybe the place they, grew up, or where they went to college, or so on. I'm a somewhat nomadic academic, so I've lived in, various parts of the country. And so there's this weird, academic, you don't quite belong anywhere kind of thing. But maybe you belong everywhere, right? And that's okay. I said I'm a nomadic academic. My entire life I've lived in the US, and I, definitely feel comfortable in most parts of the US. I probably wouldn't feel as comfortable, or, it'd be harder for me if I went to a place that doesn't speak English, right? Or speaks very little English. So again, belonging is important. As far as the migration costs, right? There's obviously financial cost of moving. I think that's probably minimal, especially for high human capital workers. It's much more these social and psychological. So many of you have probably moved at least some point in time. When you move, right, you kind of are starting over with friends and social groups, right? And that can be exciting, can be awesome, but it can also be kind of scary, be kind of lonely at times. And so that can be, a bit challenging. And again, the psychological costs, like I said, those kind of things of comfort that you're attached to, you're familiar with, you belong, there's certainly real costs when you move away. But again, a lot of people do move, and why do people move? Again, job opportunities are a big part of that. If again, I'm originally from Memphis. Why do I not live in Memphis? Well, because given the job market for being an academic economist, there were better options for me, given what was available to me elsewhere. And that's true for a lot of people, right? Sometimes you have better job opportunities elsewhere. And of course, a lot of people also, even beyond the job market, they just want something different, right? They want to live in a different place. Maybe you grew up in a small town, you want to try out the big city. Some people decide they love that. Some people decide it's not quite for them. I went to graduate school, I was telling John, I went to graduate school in Atlanta precisely because I wanted to live in the big city and kind of, get to experience that. And then kind of realized, the traffic's not so great, right? And so I have not lived in a big city since. I said before, and we'll talk about this more, again, important factor here is that human capital increases migration. I might have frozen it up somehow. It's not, okay. So again, a title of the talk is Human Capital in the Heartland. What is the Heartland? Some of you may use this term a lot, some of you don't. Again, before I started this talk, I wasn't actually sure what people call the Heartland because different people call it different things. A lot of times it is used to refer to the Midwest. Sometimes it's referred to like Middle America. That can include like the South Central or parts of the South. I'm going to use it to mean the Midwest in this talk because alliteration is fun. So human capital in the Heartland. But it's important to remember that even if we think about the Midwest as the Heartland, it is not a monolith. It's not one thing, right? So Iowa and North Dakota are similar, but there's differences, right? And of course, North Dakota and Minnesota are similar, but there's differences. And Ohio versus Missouri, right? There's differences. And so we know there's differences, but again, for the purpose of this talk, there are some commonalities. And so again, as far as human capital, attracting and retaining human capital is kind of a common challenge for the region as a whole. Now there's some parts of the region that do particularly well. Also, it is the case that many labor markets in the Midwest have lower average salaries than many parts, other parts of the country, including the Northeast and the West Coast. And of course, the complement to that is those areas also have higher cost of living. We can come back to that. We can have Q&A and talk about that. The Midwest is also, as a region, not had a lot of population growth in the past few decades, right? So there's been this, really a lot. There's a notion of a sun belt, like in the South and through the Southwest, and even California, where at least over some parts of that time, you had a lot of population inflows, a lot of migration, a lot of growth, and more recently in the mountain regions, right? You've seen a lot of growth. The Midwest has had a lot less population and employment growth overall. And then one final point that you may become obvious after a while, but overall the Midwest is less urbanized than say the Northeast and the West, at least as far as where people live. And so we will come back to that. Again, I'm going to present some data and maybe a little too much data, and some of it I'm probably going to go kind of quickly because it's a lot. But if people want to ask questions later, I'm certainly happy to go back and clarify. I'm going to use data from the American Community Survey, so they ask a lot of questions to people about their work, their education. I'm going to focus on a specific age group, 25 to 64, because they are, really mostly strongly attached to the labor market, not completely. Most of those people are not retired. Some of them are. Most of those people are kind of past their peak schooling. Some are still in school, but it's a useful, kind of broad age range to look at. I did skip a point, right, that I'm going to present some facts. The facts are indisputable. The interpretation is not, and so I will often try to interpret them. Again, we could interpret them somewhat differently. As far as I said earlier, we're going to focus on education because that's where the light is. We're also going to be even more specific. We're going to focus on bachelor's degree completion, or the percentage of the population that has a bachelor's degree. That is a single measure, but it's a common measure used in kind of this realm of economics. And so we'll do that, but of course also recognize that there's other measures we could use. Migration is really, really hard to measure in like publicly available data like this. We'd like to know where somebody's lived at every point in their entire life. We do not have that. So I'm going to focus on kind of a particularly crude measure of migration for the most part, that what I call lifetime migration. So basically tracking people between the place where they were born and the place where they live in 2023 during the survey. And so that, again, it's a crude measure because some people may be born in an area and they move away when they're 1 year old and live entirely. Some people may have, lived in that same place for their whole life. And so it's, again, very broad, but it's available, and I think it actually does illustrate the basic points pretty well. So again, I'm going to present what I call like facts. Again, these are the facts are indisputable. Interpretation. I'll give you the fact, and then sometimes I'll give you the interpretation, right? And you can think about that for yourself. So fact one, college graduates are geographically more mobile than non-college graduates, or education increases mobility. And so as an illustration, again, if we focus on that migration, the kind of key question is what percentage of people live in their birth state? And of course, that's going to vary across states, but it's also going to vary a lot by education. And it turns out people with less education are less geographically mobile. They migrate less than people with more education. So more education means more migration. So I'm going to measure this as kind of really the opposite of migration, kind of the retention rate, the percentage of people that really live in their birth state. So among people with no college education, about 70% live in their birth state. Once you go to people with a bachelor's degree, it's down to 56.6%. And then if you move up to people with a Ph.D., it's only 40.9%. And so people like me, with Ph.D., they tend to move a lot. And again, why? Well, because University of Memphis didn't offer me a job. And so I had to go somewhere else, right? That's okay. And part of it is because for better or worse, a lot of academics have very specialized education that makes it kind of hard. If you want to look at this a little more detail, right, this just shows the birth state residence rate across various education groups with no college on the left. So that's people with a high school diploma and people with less than a high school diploma, just lumped together. And then this is some people with some college, bachelor's, master's, professional. You can see that as we move from less education to more, this thing goes down. And so that's, again, an important fact. Okay, fact two, again, this is about human capital in the heartland. Again, heartland, we're talking about the Midwest. Midwest residents are on average less educated than Midwest natives. And when I say native, I mean being born in the Midwest. And again, I know some people, like I said, there's, when do you become a native or not? The joke in Atlanta was if you've been there for at least 5 years, you're a native, because nobody was from there, supposedly. But again, okay, we're saying Midwest residents are less educated than Midwest natives. Another way to interpret that, again, there's an interpretation here, but the Midwest loses college graduates to other regions. And so some numbers here, we can just very simply split the US into 4 census regions. So we've got the Northeast, Midwest, South, and the West. And then we can say, okay, among the people that live there in 2023, what percent have a bachelor's degree or higher? And again, this is ages 25 to 64. And we can also say, well, among people in this survey, the sample that were born in each region, what percent have a bachelor's degree or higher? And so that's what we have in these first two columns. These are the college graduate share, the bachelor's share by residents, and this is by natives. And so by among the natives, Midwest, 39.3% have a bachelor's. Among the residents, only 36.8%. And so that means, there's sort of like a deficit here, and we can talk more about that. Now, a couple other points, right? The Northeast has the most education on both. It also has a deficit here, but they're educating their residents, and their natives are very educated, and their residents are pretty educated. The South is consistently the lowest. The West is the second highest among residents and the third among natives. Looking at this column, though, you see that the South and West is sort of on net gaining human capital. The Northeast and the Midwest are kind of on net losing human capital. But again, in a lot of ways, especially significant deficit there, reduction for the Midwest. All right, fact 3, that's going to build on this thing a little bit more, is that if we think about college graduation rates, right, we showed there's the average for the Midwest. We know the Midwest is a big region, right? There's a lot of states. The other regions are pretty big and diverse too. So let's split it up a little bit. I'll show you a map. It turns out, there are some states in the Midwest that actually have pretty high rates of college graduation, including North Dakota. So very high rates of college graduation among natives, less true for residents. And again, part of the interpretation here is similar to before. Really, there's a brain drain story that's very notable for the Midwest. And so this is by birth state, the college graduate share. So this is, again, the natives. Among people born in each state, what percent have a bachelor's degree or higher? Red means higher numbers. That's the top category. The dark blue means lower. Again, North Dakota ends up in that top category along with Minnesota, also Nebraska, and then some of these Northeast states, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Rhode Island, I think. So again, obviously there's differences though. If you look at Ohio and Indiana and Michigan, they're not the same. So there is in terms of even the production, there are differences within the Midwest. And again, it's kind of notable, right, that kind of the plains or the western parts of the Midwest are really pretty good at producing human capital. Lots of natives earn bachelor's degrees at high rates. Now you might think, well, then of course we're going to see the same pattern when we go to by residents. We don't. So when we go to the college graduate share by current residents in each state, right? You don't see those same high, red. Minnesota and Illinois actually top the region, but North Dakota is in like the third group here, and some of these other states are not doing so well. A very simple way of building on this is to do kind of a brain gain or brain drain. So you can take kind of the difference between those two figures. So before I had a table where I had the differences by regions, we can basically do that same difference for every state. And so if you're a resident, if your college graduate share among residents is higher than among natives, that's brain gain. You're bringing in a lot of high human capital workers. If your resident share is lower, that's brain drain. You're losing essentially on net. How does most of the Midwest do? A lot of negative, right? Most of the Midwest is very, very blue. And again, as far as like the red is the top, so the red's the brain gain. The dark blue is the brain drain. And so on net, right, a lot of Midwest states are losing human capital. And again, North Dakota among them. Where are the red places? Well, again, you got a few little places in the Northeast, but also here in the kind of the DC in North Carolina, and then this is, I always get confused, this is Colorado, Oregon, Washington. And then, the second group, you've actually got some pockets along the Sun Belt, right? And so, we do see some key facts there. Another thing that is not as obvious, right, but this was brain gain drain by state, and I had this thing here, this is like their birth state or not. what if people are just moving within the region, right? So that's another question that may be not obvious. What if just like people in Illinois are going to Minnesota and you know, vice versa? It turns out that's not really the case. Another way we can think about it is instead of whether you live in your birth state, what about living in your birth region? So it turns out we can look at that. And so Midwest native college graduates are less likely to live in their birth state and their birth region than, say, people in the South and the West. Again, it's consistent with brain drain. So the first column here is just summarizing the percentage of college graduates that live in their birth state. And, you know, it's higher for the South and West, lowest for the Northeast. The Midwest is not necessarily, you know, not so great there. But if you go to living in the birth region, right, that's where the South and the West, I think, really shine, really, really high rates of retaining people, at least in the broader region. And the Midwest, again, still outpacing the Northeast, but overall much lower than the South and West. And so again, you know, that's consistent with this idea, right, that a lot of the human capital that's produced in the Midwest ends up leaving the region. And so it's not just brain drain from individual states, there's also brain drain outside the region. Key fact 5, and so this is where, again, I give you a piece of evidence that may be a possible explanation, but again, I'm not gonna hang my hat on it, right? And again, interpretation, like I said, is somewhat the responsibility of the audience. You know, one of the potential factors, though, again, are job opportunities, salaries, wages, et cetera. And so it turns out the Midwest does have relatively low earnings on average compared to a lot of other regions. And so among college graduates, the mean earnings are lowest in the Midwest. Now, this is, again, an average, and we'll come back to that, but they're highest in the Northeast, highest in the West, among the means, lowest in the Midwest. If you go to the median, which in a lot of ways could be a better measure, then the South has a lower median and the Midwest is slightly higher, but the Midwest is still much lower than the Northeast and West. Again, keep in mind cost of living, right? New York's very expensive. California is very expensive. And so there is obviously this cost of living differential that matters. But you can at least think that maybe somehow this is part of the story, though it's almost certainly complicated. Another factor, though, as I said before, that there are differences within the Midwest, right? Differences within the heartland. It's not a monolith. And so you probably should expect some areas are doing better in terms of growth, some areas are doing better in terms of human capital, some areas are doing better in terms of earnings. That is absolutely true. How do we summarize that? You know, there's different ways, right? And we could have state maps and things like that. Another way to summarize it, though, in terms of like urban and regional economics, is to think about urban size as being a factor. And so we can think about focusing on the Midwest, the heartland, and say, well, let's kind of break it down. Let's look at Chicago as its own thing. Let's kind of consider other large metro areas. We've got some kind of medium-sized metropolitan areas, some smaller metro areas, and then non-metropolitan areas, and kind of see how they're doing on some of these metrics. It turns out college education shares, this is all by residents now, are much higher, you know, for the bigger metropolitan areas and much lower for the non-metro and the smaller metro. And so you might think, well, of course, you know, the non-metro areas, you know, there's a lot of farming and you don't necessarily, you know, you have some, obviously, college graduates, but not everybody's going to have a college degree. But even among the small metros and the medium metros, right, the college shares are much lower than here. And so this is not, for kind of urban regional economists, is not especially surprising, but it's kind of suggesting at least that college graduates are attracted to larger labor markets, right? And part of the reason for that, again, cost of living, cost of living. But part of the reason for that is if we look at the median the median earnings, the median annual incomes for college graduates across these regions, they're higher in these areas. And again, cost of living, okay. You guys are getting that point, right? But again, the median in Chicago, right, is 75,000. The median in non-metro is only 58,000. And this is averaged over ages 25 to 64. So again, also keep in mind that this is not necessarily the salary you'd get as a 22-year-old recent college graduate. This is an average, all right, well, a median over that age range. Fact 7 that it doesn't fit as neatly into the other parts of the story, but I thought I had to have it in here. Is that many parts of the Midwest are experiencing slow or negative population growth. There's some areas that are growing. Talk about those shortly, but many parts have slow or negative population growth. I went with a county level map on this, and again, I may kind of regret it because it's so many different colors and schemes and whatever. But in this case, you have the dark color means high growth, the lighter means negative or low growth. And so obviously there's a lot of variability, but you can certainly see some pockets of growth here. This is Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, a lot of growth in Florida, a lot of growth in Texas. You got kind of this mountain region here, a lot of growth. Again, the Midwest kind of goes from here to here. Right, you do have some places that are growing, but a lot of places that are not, right? There's a lot of kind of white spots in here, or light colored spots. So overall, right, and again, we could do a different table where we do, population growth for the Midwest versus the other regions. It's overall, at least compared to the South and the West, it's lower. I should clarify, this is since 2020. So this is recent, but if we extend it a little further, you'd see largely similar stuff. Fact 8 is that, I said before, size matters. Midwest local labor markets are on average smaller than other regions. And it's hard to aggregate this completely, but I'll show you a few different things. And so on average, workers in the Midwest are more likely to live in non-metro areas and more likely to live in small metro areas compared to the other regions. And so again, there's not a perfect way to do this. But if you look at, what percentage of residents live in a metropolitan area at all? In the Midwest, it's 78.2%. In the West, it's 91.1%. And then Northeast and South, in the mid 80s. So the Midwest, the opposite of that would be living in a non-metro area. Right, about 22% of Midwest residents live in non-metro areas, which is much higher than the others. And you could say, well, what percent, these are sort of like cumulative things, what percent live in, like an MSA of 500,000 or higher, 1.5 million or higher, 5 million or higher, and so on. The Midwest is pretty consistently, with like an exception here, right, but otherwise pretty consistently the lowest share living in like larger areas. And so that's probably part of the story, that, the Midwest, if you think about the history, the origins, right, a lot of agriculture, a lot of like kind of smaller manufacturing towns. And so a lot of the areas have remained kind of relatively small compared to some of the other parts of the country. And so again, I said earlier, size matters. Again, higher, the large labor markets offer higher wages. There's also more opportunities for career growth and advancement. And it sounds like I'm telling you guys all to run off the big city. I'm not, but just stay with me for a little bit. But there's also more access to innovative industries, diverse consumption, perceived sophistication. A lot of people value these things, or at least they at least want to experience them. And so, there certainly are large labor market advantages. Some questions, and again, we're not going to answer them today, but I'll just throw them out there, is, some of the larger MSAs, if larger MSAs are so great, why is Chicago not doing so great? Why is Detroit not doing so great? Why is Cleveland not doing so great? Why is whatever other large MSA in the Midwest you want to pick that's not doing so great, not doing so great? There's a lot of reasons probably. Probably has to do with the kind of historical industrial structure. So the Detroit is kind of easy to pick on, being that they were very heavily industrialized, very dependent on autos, and they have transitioned to more service-oriented economy. But again, they were maybe not as set up for success as a lot of other places. And so, okay. And some of the other areas, Cleveland, to some extent Chicago, have experienced similar issues. The other thing that some people talk about is overall, the Midwest does have some tech jobs, but has not been, maybe as successful as attracting like high-tech jobs as the other regions. Why that is, I don't know. Again, that is a hard thing to say. But in some areas, of course, are more successful than others within the Midwest, but as a region, not quite as successful. Some people talk about legacy cost, and again, we could debate endless amounts on that, so I'm just going to skip it. A lot of people talk about attracting in migrants, right? So I think this is kind of maybe the thing that I would encourage you to think more about. Is obviously we're going to lose some people to some areas, but can we attract people from elsewhere? And it's kind of hard. Obviously, the weather can be a challenge. Again, I'm originally from the South. The weather is something you kind of acquire a tolerance for it over time, but it can be a bit discouraging early on. And so my joke, and this is true, is that when I first moved to Iowa, we moved in 2018 in June, and it was like 80 degrees all summer. And I was like, this is awesome. Why doesn't everyone live here? Because 80 degrees is pretty nice. Again, coming from the South, we're used to like 95 or to 100 and humidity and horrible. So I'm like, why doesn't everybody live here, right? This is awesome. Then my first winter come, we had a polar vortex and weather worse than, or as bad or worse than this week. And then my follow-up is, why does anyone live here, right? And of course, that was 1 week, right? And again, we don't have that every year, and you learn to tolerate that and acclimate. But if you've never been exposed to that, right? You've never lived in the Midwest or even other part of the country where it gets cold, and it can be a bit daunting. You're almost like, how is it survivable? But you do survive. So what the Midwest should do is force everybody to spend a week here in the winter, and then like when they survive, no, I'm joking. That's probably not a good idea. But the point is, people have this perception, certainly the weather is horrible and intolerable. It's not quite that bad. There's probably some other misperceptions, again, lack of experience exposure, maybe you need more positive things. So again, the sporting events they try, but holding the Super Bowl in Detroit in February probably isn't that marketable as they think, even though they have a dome or elsewhere. And again, but there could be other ways to increase exposure. There are some Midwest success stories. And so some of you may know Fargo is doing pretty well recently. And so since 2020, Fargo is actually the third fastest growing MSA in the Midwest by percentage. And so that's a pretty cool fact that you can tell your friends. I'm sure people in here know more about that than me, but it's reasonably affordable housing, good job opportunities, nice quality of life, other stuff. One of the other things that you have seen with some MSAs in the Midwest that have grown is sometimes due to like the hollowing out of rural areas. People leaving the farm, leaving the rural areas, and I guess I'll go live in the city that's not too far away because then I can stay close to family and things like that. I don't actually know if that's been a big contributor for Fargo. And I'm sure there's lots of other things I don't know. The map you saw, you may have noticed there were some areas like in the Black Hills in South Dakota. You had kind of like southwest Missouri, like Branson and the Ozarks that have done pretty well. You've also had, I said, yeah, some of these big metros aren't doing well. Some of them, medium, small, and large, are doing well. If they can become kind of financial hubs or like healthcare hubs. And so, Sioux Falls is relatively small, but has done well. Des Moines, which is just down the road from me, has done well. Indianapolis, Columbus, and so on. College towns have historically done well in the past 20, 30 years, right? Because if you can produce human capital, you can often retain some of it. I presented a paper yesterday about fracking. North Dakota fracking counties have done pretty well. But it's not clear that what these success stories, that it's easy to transfer that to the other areas, right? What exactly is making each of these succeed is sometimes very specific. And again, maybe not a broad solution. So what to do? It depends on who you are, right? So if you're a policymaker, stakeholder, right, you're, on the local chamber of commerce, you're the local mayor of some town, right? You should probably try to help your area grow. And so I somewhat jokingly say, make America's Heartland cool again. I don't know what that means, but you probably shouldn't ask me how to make the Midwest cool. I don't know. But ask people that know, right? Ask people that like, hey, how could we make the Midwest cool? How can we make it a place that people want to live? They want to visit, they want to spend time, right? And try to do that. Amenities are a big part of that, right? People like things to do. And so whatever things people like, right? If we can invest in that, we can improve it, that's good. I think remote work opportunities is probably at a point where a lot of smaller towns and smaller metros and rural areas could really use that as a lifeline. Okay, the town doesn't have a lot of jobs, but people want to live there because they've lived there for generations. Well, if they could, have a job remotely that, okay, the company's in the city a little ways over, that could be a great opportunity, right? But again, it's hard. It takes, obviously infrastructure, broadband, lots of other stuff. It takes knowledge, takes connections. We talk a lot about homegrown entrepreneurship. I'm a big believer in that, right? Again, I think Fargo probably has had some success with that. And it can be, obviously restaurants, but also, whether it be tech startups or whatever, right? That you can certainly get some benefit out of that. This idea of trying to lure tech jobs and tech workers, I have a question mark there because what does that mean in terms of trying to lure? Are we going to provide incentives? I will tell you that some of these, again, I'm not trying to, some of the incentive programs that have been tried across the country are probably very expensive per job, right? So if we're going to throw money at Microsoft or, whoever, I shouldn't be specific. We're going to throw money at some corporation to, let's put some jobs here. We need to do the estimate of, okay, how much is that going to cost us per job? And if it's a really big number, it's probably not worth it. Some of the other places have tried these remote work credits where we're going to just give the worker, if they can work remotely, we're going to give them a bunch of money. Well, how much are we doing per job? And is it actually impactful? Maybe, right? We got to do some sort of cost benefit analysis there. Okay, well, suppose you're not a policymaker, you're just thinking about what should I do? You're an individual. Live your best life, right? Whatever that means to you, right? So try to figure out what you want out of life and go for it. And again, if you're young, right, that probably does mean trying some new things. Again, that may mean moving away or at least going visiting some new places. For some people, again, you may have an opportunity to come back in the future. That's great. But again, I also say it is okay. Like if your best life is living where your family is, that's awesome too, right? That's okay. You can invest in your community, help it thrive. And I say you do you. So as I'm closing, a couple of things that I did not intend to have in the presentation, but first, a lot of people probably know what this is. Is there anybody that doesn't know what this is? You all know what this is? Okay, somebody tell me what is this? What's the name of it? So I don't know. I think it's pronounced Yimkomst. Anyway, that's sort of anyway. But this is the Viking ship that you can go over to Moorhead, right, in the Yimkomst Center, and you can see this thing. And so I actually I go visit an area, go check things out. And so I went and saw this. And again, I went because Viking ships are cool, and I thought, hey, it'd be cool to look at. But the story is amazing, right? So the story, if you've never been, go. It's pretty cool. It's worth the $12. But basically, there was a guy that had a crazy idea that he wanted to build a Viking ship and sail it across the ocean. That sounds kind of crazy, right? And again, he didn't do it by himself, but he had this idea, he had this vision, this passion to build something, to do something. And then he convinced other people to do it with him, right? He got his family on board with it, his community, a lot of donors, a lot of people pitched in. And the amazing thing is they did it. They built this thing, which is awesome, right? So that's an awesome thing to build this. And then they actually sailed it, all the way to Norway. And so that's amazing, right? That's like the guy had a crazy idea. He convinced people to go along with it. And so that's what we call a moonshot. A moonshot, like you have this big ambitious goal and you say, hey, let's go for it. And that's, again, pretty impressive local thing. I'm very, very pleased that I got to see that. Probably the most famous moonshot is the moonshot, right? JFK's moonshot. So we're going to play a very brief clip.
Come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why 35 years ago fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Yeah, that is it. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, in the front.
In your migration data, how is international migration handled, and how does its inclusion or exclusion impact your analysis?
Yeah, and so the question is about international migration. So in my data, how is it handled, and how would it impact the analysis and interpretation? The short answer is I take a very overly simplistic approach in this, and that I do include migrants, right, in the residents, but they're not in the natives. And so that in some ways could stack the deck a little bit, in that if an area is especially good at attracting international migrants, they'll look better on some of these measures. If they're especially bad, they'll look worse. It's a simplistic thing, and we could, as a practical thing, we could exclude international immigrants and would get very similar patterns for this stuff. As a practical matter, the Midwest is not especially good at attracting international immigrants. And so again, the short answer is why, or the question is why. I will tell you, I have some separate work that honestly, what I said about the cold is partially true, that a lot of international immigrants see if they come from more warmer climates, they see the cold weather as an obstacle. And so I think that is something, again, if you've never experienced it, right, you don't know. The other side is just distance, right? So if you think about Latin American immigrants, well, it's a lot further to North Dakota than it is to Texas or Oklahoma or wherever. So as far as, again, as far as the analysis, I don't do anything fancy. I just very simple. They're just in there. As far as the interpretation, there's a lot of big questions around that, and I think that's a policy discussion that's probably beyond my talk, if that makes sense. But great question, yeah.
So my question is about the age framework that you used in your analysis, that is from 25 years to 64 years. So my thing is I can see 4 generations in there: Gen Z, Gen X, Gen Y, and baby boomers. So as the theory of generational cohorts say, that people from the same generations show the same attitudes and behaviors, and also attitudes towards innovation and technology. Even the migration issue is handled differently by different generations. Then the psychological issues, for me, I can say that I'm from millennial generation, and I cannot hide my accent. My Bangladeshi accent, where my daughter speaks the same way the people here speak. So, and the quality of human capitals also differ among generations. So my question is the analysis you used, can generation-wise differences can be shown in the analysis, which may reflect the migration trend in a more granular way? Because I think from a policymaker's perspective, that the one you use make Heartland great again, Mata. So even the definition of cool is different among generations.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And again, in some ways, I glossed over various complexities just to simplify things. As far as the migration literature, a lot of focus is really on kind of younger skilled workers. Again, I didn't do that. Again, we're already probably too much data in here, but the other thing is I focus on a single year snapshot, and that some of the stuff I do, if you make the sample smaller, like the standard errors and the confidence intervals, just get larger and it's noisier. And so I could do it for some of the analysis, but I didn't do it for the others. But I think you're absolutely right that if you're a policymaker, quite honestly, Should you be attracting 64-year-olds or 25-year-olds? Well, both. The answer is both, right? But at the margins, like who's got more opportunity and maybe who's more sensitive to various options, there may be some rationale for really targeting the younger workers. Again, that doesn't mean neglect others, but so yes, there are differences. And again, as far as the make America's Heartland cool again, the answer, how you do that will be different for the 64 and the 25-year-old. So yeah, great comments. Yeah. Yes.
So a lot of the areas in the Midwest that have a lot of brain drain, like Minnesota or Dakota, invest a lot in education. Is that like, in your view, like a problem for those areas? Do they invest so much in education heavily, or is that kind of just a benefit to the citizens that live there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question's about, you have this brain drain in parts, and they invest a lot in education. In some ways, are they not, more or less, are they not getting a good return on their investment? Is one way to think about it. And again, it kind of does depend on your perspective. And so, let's say my kids, for example, they're going to school in Iowa, and let's say they leave, they go to Missouri or Texas or wherever. If I stay in Iowa, then as a parent, my kids are educated, and so that's really good for me, and so I still benefit. Now, if we all leave, then you could argue that there is some loss there. Again, I'm someone that has moved. My family has stayed in that same area. So part of what I would say is that there's multiple layers of benefits. Certainly, you're benefiting the individual, and I think, as a philosophy, I think we want to give kids the best education possible. What that means exactly, right? You can interpret. But also, again, if their parents, their family, their friends can benefit from their education, then it is good. It's good for them, even if the kids leave. So I'm not someone that says disinvest in education. Some people would say that, if all these people are leaving, we should disinvest in education. I can't swallow that pill. And maybe that's because I have a bias because I'm an educator. Maybe it's because I have a bias because I'm educated and because I've moved around. But I can't swallow that pill. So I think, yes, the education is valuable. Now, should there be more, you could argue like federal financing of K-12 education and public and higher education? Maybe. Right, I'm not currently in a position to make that happen, but maybe, right? Maybe the states and locals should not invest or be the overwhelming investors in education. Maybe there should be more federal. Yeah, sure.
So sort of on the flip side, you didn't answer it in the talk, so it may not be an answer you have, but what is the economic impact of the brain drain? Potentially, I don't like it when my students leave because it makes me sad, but that's irrelevant. So, but are there industries that we could have if we were retaining people? What are we actually losing along with our college-educated folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of things, and it kind of depends on which ones you want to focus on. So the tax base is one that we sometimes talk about. So if these highly educated people make more money, then having them in the local economy would contribute to the tax base, and that's great. One of the things about the tax base, right, is if we have this great resource, these educated people, if they pay more taxes, then in a lot of ways that means I get to either pay less taxes or I get better services. And so there's like just a fiscal issue there that these highly educated people that could make a lot of money, pump a lot of money into the tax base, we lose those. What I said too about, the jobs, again, some people will benefit from that more than others. And so, if these highly educated people that are innovative and solve problems, create new jobs, they may not create a job for me, but they might create a job for my neighbor. And so it's one of those things where I would say in that regard, not everybody directly benefits, but a lot of people do directly benefit. And the fact that some people benefit a lot probably is good for other people. It's kind of, similar to if you think about a local area, right? Not everybody utilizes every public service. Whether it be parks or whatever. So I live right next to a park and we utilize that park a lot. There's another park that's on the south side of town or, over here, I don't ever go to. But I benefit from some services, other people benefit from other services, and, that's how local government works. Yeah, John.
So somebody was talking about you were talking about the brain drain of people leaving, but have you done any research to look at having a university and how it actually could cause in migration. So you talked about having experience being in the Midwest, so maybe somebody internationally, and Vishali's probably an example of this, comes to NDSU and thinks it's really cold, or Fargo's really cold, and then kind of get used to it. You're like, maybe I want to live here. I mean, so have you done any research to look at the brain gain as a result of having universities that we get?
So yeah, the short answer is there is some literature on that. I have worked on that some. Historically, what is most, so this is maybe not as positive an answer as you would like. Historically, mostly what's happened is a redistribution, say, within the state or within the region. And so like I have a paper on this, it's actually my most cited paper, that areas that have, these higher education institutions tend to grow. They tend to grow in population, employment, et cetera. But a big chunk of that is because they're pulling people from all the other parts of the state. And so that's a good thing in a lot of ways, but it's also kind of brain redistribution within the state, moving around. Now, can you bring in people from outside the state? The short answer is yes, right? It is harder, as far as like causal research, it's actually harder to identify that for various reasons. One is that the people that come from out of state, they're not randomly selected, and it's not, they're not like representative. And so those people, again, some of them do stay. There's evidence of that, right? I think you probably track that data. People that come from out of state or even come from other countries, some of them do stay. But of course, a lot of them leave, but it's hard to know the net effect. So I guess what I would say is that anecdotally, there's a lot of evidence consistent with what you're saying. As far as do I have like a rigorous research study that says, tell me the number or the percent that this is increasing by, I don't have one, and I'm not gonna make one up. I'm not gonna hallucinate like ChatGPT, right? Yeah.
All industries over time tend to become more productive, more efficient, and farming is an excellent example of that because of what's happened over the last few hundred years. So, as areas like the eastern part of North Dakota provide more job opportunities, doesn't that then become an opportunity to keep people in the state who otherwise may have to leave because there aren't as many ag jobs as there were before? So it would seem there's a positive to that in-state migration.
Yeah, no, I think it could, like I said, that one is one that could cut both ways. And again, yeah, you've obviously seen rural areas. I mean, yeah, farming has become more mechanized and it takes less workers. And a lot of those people, yeah, part of it is, can we find ways, give them skills to be useful, send them to North Dakota State University, get them a great education, right? And then, especially young people, and then, obviously employ them in other sectors. So that it is a big part of it. And again, I would say in many ways, like I said, I think higher education and good higher education institutions, to kind of go back to John's question, I think they're critical in a lot of ways. I think I do have work on this. They are critical for building human capital and keeping your human capital in state. And so that is a big part. Again, I was just less clear that you can really bring in people as much. And so, yeah, certainly the economy is always changing. Again, I thought about dabbling more in AI in the talk, right? But again, this is a question, what's going to happen, right, with some of the technological changes that are coming. It might be good for the Midwest, honestly. It may make jobs a little less centralized and a little more remote workable. And so that could be, again, good for many parts of the Midwest, including some of the less populous areas. But again, that's incredibly speculative, right? Almost anything we talk about, like the future economy, and especially starting about AI, we should have wide uncertainty on it, and I would say I do.